Civil rights is a word we have heard for many decades. The civil rights movement began in 1954 and is designed to ensure the right to political and social equality. Now, most often we may think of Black Lives Matter, women's movement, and LGBTQ. Those are marked by notable events such as the 1963 March on Washington, where Martin Luther King delivered the famous I Have a Dream speech, the U.S. Supreme Court ruling of Roe v. Wade, and the Stonewall uprisings in 1969 in New York. But there are other groups that have had their civil rights called into question. I am going to address two of those groups today: Native Americans and people with disabilities, and see how they have been affected and what we can do to reduce the discrimination of these groups. The history of Native Americans is rich and full of heritage and culture. However, according to History.com, it brings out that between 1778 and 1871, there were over 368 treaties made in the U.S. with Native Americans. The basic idea of these treaties was that each tribe was an independent nation with their own rights. But as white settlers began moving onto Native American lands, this conflicted with the goal of expanding civilization. The results were deliberate broken promises on the part of the U.S. government, such as the Treaty of Ermine. In this treaty, the U.S. government, according to the Sioux Treaty of 1868, the U.S. recognized the Black Hills of Dakota as the Great Sioux Reservation. But after gold was discovered on the Black Hills, miners and settlers began moving onto the land in large groups that eventually drove the Native Americans out. But treaties were not the only way of the misuse of Native Americans' rights. Biological warfare was yet another way. One of the most infamous, well-documented cases was when the U.S. Army used smallpox against Native Americans during the siege of Fort Pitt in 1763. According to academicunion.edu, Commander-in-Chief Jeffrey Amherst's name became tarnished by stories of smallpox, infected blankets used as drone warfare against Native American Indians to try and weaken them. The violation of Native American civil rights has had a lasting impact on their culture. The purpose of educating Native American children in the U.S. was to assimilate and civilize them. Children were forcibly removed from their homes and communities, placed in boarding schools or taught in missionary schools, and prohibited from using their languages, practicing their customs, or exhibiting any form of Native culture. This assimilation policy was eventually abandoned in the 1970s, but unfortunately, the legacy of discrimination and segregation in the education system remains. Recent data shows that Native American students lag behind their other students in a range of academic achievement. In 2011, less than 20% of Native fourth graders were proficient or advanced in reading and math, as compared with more than 40% of their white peers. In 2011 through 2012, the high school graduation rate for Native American students was 67%, which was the lowest of any racial or ethnic group. Access to quality health care is also an issue. The Indian Health Service, which is the federal agency that provides health services for many American Indians and Alaskan Natives, is chronically underfunded and under-resourced. In 2018, most of its hospitals were reportedly operating with less than 50 total beds, while the agency had about 20% fewer doctors than what it was believed was ideal. It's impossible to know COVID-19's true toll on the Native American community, but we can see with statistics such as 74% of coronavirus cases and 89 deaths on average, according to the COVID tracking project, was from Native Americans. Just here in Arizona, COVID has been very proficient. According to the Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention, American Indian and Alaska Native people are 5.3 times more likely than white people to be hospitalized due to COVID-19, which again is the largest gap in any racial or ethnic group. Now let's go on to people with disabilities. People with visual impairments might include loss of vision, loss of peripheral vision due to glaucoma, blurred vision due to diabetes, extreme sensitivity to light due to migraines. According to the CDC, there are 61 million adults in the U.S. who live with some kind of disability. That means 26 of our total population. 13.7% of those disabilities affect mobility, and 10.8 are cognitive and have some impact on the ability to concentrate or make decisions. These could include ADHD, ADD, or just difficulty in expressing themselves verbally or in written form, such as dyslexia. Simple accommodations to support those with physical disabilities could include ensuring that ensuring the entrance and width of doorways is able to accommodate wheelchairs, installing hand-operated door openers. Visual accommodations could include providing software that enables speech reading, verbal messaging in place of reading a computer screen, color coding, or filing systems. Hearing accommodations might be as simple as arranging for American Sign Language translators for interviews, doctor's appointments, court appearances. Cognitive accommodations can sometimes be harder to accommodate because it might not be as visible, but still accommodations can be made. Those can be providing longer time to work on school assignments or work projects, a quiet space for greater concentration, maybe moving a desk or workspace to the end of an aisle instead of in the busier area. So, what do we do with all this information? Well, hopefully, we have become more aware of the history and misuse of civil rights, especially for these two groups. We can all take the initiative to become more educated on cultural misappropriation. That occurs when a person from one culture adopts the fashion trends or styles from another culture. One way we can start is by recognizing and using the proper terminology. Native Americans are not savages. People with hearing disabilities are not mute or dumb. The use of sports teams and names and mascots that perpetuate stereotypes such as the Redskins or Braves shouldn't be accepted in 2021 anymore. And we should educate ourselves on the proper behavioral manner. Don't assume that a person with a visual disability needs you to grab their arm and guide them. Don't assume that you need to speak louder or slower to a person who is reading your lips. Make sure your clothing demonstrates your understanding of the importance of cultural heritage. For example, for Native Americans, the headdress is a sacred ceremonial adornment, not a costume for a Halloween party. All of us are different in some way. That's what makes us unique. The Civil Rights Act, as well as the American Disability Act of 1990, was established to ensure that everyone was protected and respected for their uniqueness. When we take the time to actually learn from one another's diversity, we find that we are more alike than we are different.